Good evening, friends. Good morning, actually, for most of you. Welcome to this episode of Un-Apologetics. I am your host, CJ Cox, and we're here to tell you that we are, of course, unapologetic about apologetics. Now, I'm having a little bit of an issue right now with my camera for some reason. I'm not sure why it's on. I apologize for that, friends. But nonetheless, we're going to have a very special episode for you today. But before we get into what the details of that are, let's very briefly go through our channel Housekeeping. Want to remind you guys of a couple things. Number one, we do have a second interview today in about 8 hours. We're going to be with Chris Date talking about physicalism and dualism. So that'll be a very interesting conversation. I hope you guys are excited for that as well. Also, want to remind you guys that in 2 days, we'll be debating Will Duffy on open theism over at the Standing for Truth channel. Let's see, I think that's at 7 p.m. if I remember correctly, but nonetheless, once you go over there, you'll be able to see the thumbnail and all that kind of stuff, so it won't matter too much. August the 20th, we have another debate with David Preston talking about whether or not modern translations of the Bible are harmful. And to give you guys an idea of where I stand on these, I am not an open theist, and I do not take a King James only position. I think there are plenty of other Bible translations which are fine. And then October 31st will be also with Twerton Fan talking about the conditional immortality, and whether or not that is actually a thing, eternal conscious torment or conditional immortality. I take the conditional immortality view there as well. So those are some things we have coming up here in the near future. Also want to remind you guys, please do like and share the video. Please do consider subscribing to the channel if you have not done so, and hit that bell to get notified every time that we go live. I am having a wee bit of trouble here. There we go. All right. I don't know why that took so long. Anyways, yeah, that's about all the channel housekeeping kind of stuff we have. We wanted to get through that really briefly because we do have a guest today, and I don't want to keep our guest waiting. So we're going to get right into the episode we have. I am joined for a third time, actually, which I very greatly appreciate, by historian David Rohl. Thank you very much for being here, and how are you doing today?
I'm fine, CJ. It's nice to be back again. It's been a while, I think. A few months at least, if not a year.
Yeah, I think it's been about a year. I'm not 100% sure, but nonetheless, it has definitely been quite some time now. And since that time, which is the subject matter we're actually getting into today, you have published what technically is 3 books, but is all kind of one group, right? And I think that's going to be a very interesting conversation for us to have, considering the subject matter of it is not just legendary kings in the general sense, but specifically legendary kings from Egypt and Israel, very important figures in world history. But before we get into some of that stuff real quickly, just and not in the same way as last time, because we do have a familiarity with the audience here,
right?
But just give us a brief kind of overview, of what it is that you do here as far as, Egyptology and history and stuff like that.
Well, it's quite a lot, actually. I'm specifically an Egyptologist. That's what my degree was in, but also ancient history. It was a combined degree at University College London, so 50-50 Egyptology and 50% ancient history. But I also did Mycenaean archaeology and Minoan archaeology, Anatolian archaeology, Levantine archaeology. All those subjects were also I took as extra curricular material at the university with some of probably the greatest professors that there are in the British field anyway, in those subject areas. So I'm quite a broad multidisciplinarian, right, in this particular area of ancient history. But I also have a background in music, because I was a record producer for many years as well, and played in quite a few bands that had record contracts. So I have a sort of modern worldview of things. I'm not an ivory tower scholar. I have a real world attitude towards interpreting the archaeology and history of the ancient world, and specifically the biblical archaeology and text. So I'm very much in favor of examining the biblical text and seeing if it matches up or compares with the archaeology. And that all depends, of course, on what chronology you choose to use to match up between ancient Egypt, for example, and its neighbor Israel. They have to synchronize in some way. Currently, with the conventional dating, they don't. Of course, they're not. They don't seem to match at all. This is why you have so many pessimists in the field who will dismiss the Bible as a sort of pious myth, because they simply can't find the archaeological evidence in the ground to combine with the text. Whereas if you revise the dating, which principally comes from Egypt, which is what I do, it's one of my specialities, we do find we can synchronize much, much better between the biblical text, the narrative, and archaeology in the Levant, which of course is the whole area of the eastern seaboard of the Mediterranean.
And with that, that'll actually, excuse me, be a good place to start here for our very first, technically, question related to the subject matter, which is just a little brief overview of the new chronology itself. Now, to briefly preface my question, for the audience's sake, there are three main ways of looking at, well, on the Egyptian side of things, there's technically three main ways. Low chronology, new chronology, and high chronology. Low and high only vary by like 20 years. It's really not that big of a difference. Whereas new chronology can vary anywhere from 200 to 300 years, depending on what particular point we're actually at.
Sure.
So you're the mastermind behind the new chronology. Go ahead and tell us a little bit about not only what that is, but also why it was so important to put together.
Right. Well, it all began really with Professor Kenneth Kitchen's little blue book, The Third Intermediate Period in Egypt, which is a complex era, dynasties 21 through to 25, which most Egyptologists steer away from because it's so complicated. It's sort of a dark age, but there's copious material there to work with. It's how you put it together that matters. And as a result of him collating all this material together in a single book in the 1970s, a number of scholars, including myself, were able to examine in detail this complex period and realize that we needed to reconstruct the history of the period, the timeline of the period, because it seemed that it had been overstretched. And what that did was it pushed back earlier dates into the distant past by about 2 centuries, 2.5 centuries, up to 3 centuries. The result of that was that the Egyptian chronology moved in relationship to biblical texts, because we have a biblical chronology which is independent of Egypt, of course, which we have in the biblical narrative. You know, for instance, a good example would be Solomon's reign beginning in 970 BC. Generally, most people would accept that. So we have an independent biblical timeline, and then we have an Egyptian timeline which needs revision because of this period called the Third Intermediate Period. And when you realign it by shortening the Third Intermediate Period by a number of centuries, then you bring down the dates of people like Ramesses II or some of the earlier pharaohs, and that then changes the relationship between those pharaohs and the biblical text. So it's a complex thing to do. It's a simple idea, but it's a complex thing to do. And you have to then find archaeological links between the strata, the tells and the strata in Israel, in the Promised Land, in relationship to Egypt, because that's how we date the tells. These are just archaeological tells. They're silent, in effect, not like the Egyptian material where you have copious reliefs on the walls of the temples, etc. You can go to Megiddo today and you won't find a single relief of King Solomon there or anybody like that. So what we rely on finding Egyptian artifacts in the Levantine, in the Israelite sites like Megiddo and Hatzor and places like that, which give us an Egyptian pharaoh's name. And then we can say, well, that stratum that we find that object in is dated to the time of Ramesses II or Thutmose III or whoever it might be. And that gives us a way of dating the stratigraphy. So the stratigraphy in Israel is dated by the Egyptian chronology, and then that's separate again from the biblical narrative chronology. So what we're trying to do is say, well, what are the levels of King Solomon in these various cities around the Israel and that area, the Promised Land? You know, what was the time of Moses and Joseph before him? What about the conquest and Joshua? All those things have to be re-examined if you change the Egyptian timeline.
Yeah, and then one of the things that I found very cool about this new chronology is that it actually ends up explaining some other areas outside of this too that we won't necessarily get too much into. But for example, making Homer a lot closer than he is supposed to be in our own timeline to the Trojan War, which he records, and it's a couple other things there. Things which I think make a lot of sense of the ancient history. But that's a good context for these books. Which, by the way, if anybody is interested in these books, they're only about $21 to get all three of them on Amazon. They are all ebooks, but nonetheless.
Yeah. Can I explain that it's actually a single volume, but because of it's much easier to download shorter versions and people might want to dip into one section, it's actually in parts 1, 2, and 3. And then there's a second volume, which will be coming out next year, which is in a similar format, which will be divided up into various parts. Well, it'll be volume 2 of Legendary Kings. It's a sort of way of making it a little bit easier to download and to absorb. People can do it in their own time. They can look at part 1 or they can look at part 3, whatever interests them, basically. So it's really one volume. And if it were to come out in print, which it may do in the future, it'll be a 400-page book with full color illustrations and charts and plans, etc. But you get all that on the ebook side because you've got it in full color. You have all the charts there. And what's fantastic about ebooks is you can highlight them and put little notes in and things. So it's a way of making a much better way of studying the material, I think.
Yeah, they're also way cheaper to not only produce but also to purchase as a result, right? I'm sure this would probably be almost triple the price for the consumer if it was a regular book, right?
Probably more than that, actually. Yes. I mean, the era of printed books, I mean, printed books have been marvelous for the last, few hundred years, but nowadays it's so expensive to print in color a 400-page book on art paper that it's actually simpler to produce it as an ebook, and it's much more affordable. If this were to be printed as a full color book, on a print to order type of situation, it would cost up to $100, and that's just way beyond most people's budget.
Yeah, no kidding. So real briefly, let's go ahead and, well, not briefly, actually, we're going to start to get into some of the deeper answers. So let's get into this series here. So while it is, like you said, it's actually a split into 3 separate I guess what would the word there be?
Parts.
Volume.
I mean, it's volume 1, part 1, 2, and 3, and then volume 2, part 1, 2, and 3 will be later.
Yeah. So what's the synopsis of? Well, yeah, synopsis is the right word. What is the synopsis of this book here, and what is the starting point we're moving forward when we begin our story?
Right. Well, the previous printed book was called Exodus, Myth or History, which dealt really with the Sojourn period from the arrival of Joseph in Egypt through the slavery up to the point where Moses is born, including the Exodus and the wanderings, and then, of course, the conquest of the Promised Land. That was all in that hardback called, and which you can still get, actually. You can get it from Amazon or the Patterns of Evidence website. So Exodus, Myth or History covered that era. And then what happened is I decided, well, I have to continue then on with the biblical narrative and the archaeology that goes with it. So the new book, Legendary Kings, it has a brief summary of the evidence from the Exodus period with the new evidence that's come along since that book came out. And there's quite a bit of that and more detail. And then it moves into the period of Judges. So there's a section on the Judges era and what archaeology corresponds with that, including places like Shiloh and Shechem, major sites in the hill country in the Judges period. And then the book continues into the Amarna period in Egypt, which is very complex, deals with the Akhenaten heresy of the monotheism, which, of course, in the new chronology is secondary to Moses. Moses still comes first as the first monotheist, and then we have Akhenaten later, whereas in the conventional dating scheme, it's the other way around. Akhenaten is the first monotheist, and somehow Moses is a copy of Akhenaten. So in this new contrast and new dating, Akhenaten and the Amarna period is contemporary with the time of King Saul in Israel and the early years of David. So we deal with that whole relationship. And of course, that's very important because we have Amarna letters in a tablet form, which came to Egypt from the various city rulers, of Syro-Palestine, or Israel, if you want to call it that at this era, Canaan, writing to Pharaoh, and they seem to match remarkably well with the era of King Saul and what we call the Hebrew revolt against the Philistines. So it ties in very nicely. We have a lot of detailed material from the Amarna letters, and we have the detail in the biblical text in the books of Samuel, and we have an opportunity then to compare the two, and they seem to match very well. So that first volume in those three parts finishes with the death of King Saul and the rise of David, and then the next volume will start really with the reign of King David, continuing into the time of King Solomon. So we're looking at major archaeological sites with huge buildings and constructions in that period, which seem to fit very well with Solomon as a great prince, merchant prince. Then it goes on into the divided monarchy period, and it goes all the way down to the time of the sack of Jerusalem by Nebuchadnezzar II. So that's volume 2. But we're talking today about volume 1, which basically means a review, as it were, of the Exodus and Sojourn period and conquest, but then in detail continuing through the Judges period through to the reign of King Saul and the death of King Saul on Mount Gilboa. That's basically what's in that volume.
And then, so now the start of this then would be immediately after the Exodus period, getting into the period of I guess immediately after the conquest would be a little bit more accurate, but
yeah.
Nonetheless, getting right there directly into the Judges period. So, for the audience sake, of course, we want to establish a few different contextual parameters here. The first one being, who is the king on one side here, the Egyptian side? Of course, there isn't going to be a king on the Israelite side for some time.
Yes.
But who would be the pharaoh that we have on the Egyptian side at this point? And take it away.
Okay, so if we look back a little bit to the time of Exodus itself, the time when the Israelites left at Passover, that would be a pharaoh called King Thutmose of the 13th dynasty. Now, he's a non-entity, really. He's not really very well known by anybody outside Egyptology. We have very little in terms of evidence of him in Egypt itself. So he's not a major figure. And I don't think the Exodus story has to be about a major king. We watch all the movies, of course, and it's Ramesses II, who's the pharaoh of the Exodus. But that's just nonsense. That's Hollywood nonsense. And unfortunately, it's what many scholars have thought for the last couple of centuries. You pick a great hero like Ramesses II, but trying to find an Exodus in his reign is a joke, really, because he's one of the most powerful pharaohs of the time, and there's absolutely no sign of an Exodus or any plagues in Egypt during his reign. So, that's why basically people like Israel Finkelstein and other archaeologists say, well, there was no Exodus from Egypt. There was no conquest of the Promised Land. Most importantly, of course, Jericho didn't exist at that time at all. It was an abandoned ruin and had been for centuries. So there can be no Joshua's conquest of the Promised Land because there was no Jericho. And then archaeologists looked back to Egypt and said, well, there was no great population of Semites in the time of Ramesses II in the Eastern Delta, and there was no Exodus. So the Bible is not historical. That's basically their argument. But if we put this whole series of events from the arrival of Joseph in Egypt to the Exodus, we are squarely in a different era now. We're not in the late Bronze Age, archaeologically speaking, which is when Ramesses II is set. We're now in the Middle Bronze Age, a very different era. And in historical terms in Egypt, we're talking about the 12th dynasty, late 12th dynasty, for when Joseph arrives in Egypt, and Moses is leaving Egypt with the Israelites in the reign of Thutmose towards the end of the 13th dynasty. So that's the era we're talking about. Now, if the Israelites then move into the desert, the wilderness, for 40 years, or approximately 40 years, it means they're arriving at Jericho now at the very time that we see Jericho as a huge city of 2,000 odd people with great walls, mud brick walls, very complex fortification system, which actually collapsed, and the whole city was destroyed and burnt to the ground and left abandoned for over 600 years. So that seems to fit much better with the story of Joshua's conquest. And all the other cities that we hear about in the biblical text of the conquest are also either destroyed at this period or abandoned. So again, it matches the story very well. So then we move into the Judges period. But of course, in Egyptian terms, what we're looking at now is the period of the Hyksos kings of Egypt. These are foreign kings who come into Egypt sometime after the reign of Thutmose. They invade Egypt, they take over the place. And interestingly, when they do invade, according to Manetho, there's no resistance from the Egyptians. The Egyptian army does not seem to be there to repel these invaders. Well, we all know why that is. If you look at your Bible, it's because the Egyptian army was drowned in the Red Sea. So that's a good reason why these invaders came in. And they actually occupy Egypt for well over a century, and they persecute and oppress the native Egyptians. And eventually, the 18th dynasty rises up against them and kicks them out. And then we have this period we call the New Kingdom in Egypt. Well, this is all contemporary with the Judges period. So the first part of the Judges period is in the time when the Hyksos were ruling in Egypt. And then the second part, what we call Late Bronze I, is the time leading all the way up to the time of Eli and the loss of the Ark at Shiloh. And then obviously the time of Samuel, the arrival of Saul in terms of the kingship. And then, of course, the Ark being brought, having been taken back from the Philistines who captured it, being brought to Jerusalem when David establishes his reign in Jerusalem. And then, of course, the Ark is then eventually placed inside the new temple built by Solomon. So that spans the entire New Kingdom effectively. So we're talking about the Judges period being half of it in the Hyksos period, Middle Bronze II, that is, or in Israeli terms, Middle Bronze III. And then that continues through the 18th dynasty, through the reigns of the great kings like Thutmose III. In this time, the Israelites are all in the hill country, then their tribes residing in tents, so they're not a threat to Egypt in that context. They don't have cities at this time. And so the Israelites are in the hill country, while the Egyptian interest is with the north, with the Mitanni in the north. So they're on the Via Maris, marching up and down, fighting with the Mitanni on the Euphrates, whereas the Israelites, the tribes, are up in the hill country, and they're not really affecting Egyptian history at all at this period. It only happens when we get this rise of the kingship in Israel with Saul that we start to see an interest between Israel and Egypt, because it threatens the city-states on the lowlands, which are effectively part of the Egyptian empire. But once Saul and Jonathan start to overthrow the Philistines in that area, of course, that becomes an issue then for the Egyptians. So we start to get contact again between Egypt and Israel at that point when the kingship starts. So this book really deals with that era, from the Hyksos era through to about the period of the Amarna era. And at that point, we start to get the kings arriving in Israel. So that's the coverage, if you like.
Yeah, and you can see the reason for the title there, right? Because now we're talking in this period, Thutmose III, Tutankhamun, Hatshepsut, and eventually, I think the end of this would be Ramses. Well, I guess it wouldn't be the end. You'd go all the way down to Nebuchadnezzar, but Ramses II is kind of the end of the period we're sort of referencing here, and you're just filled with a bunch of, like, even Seti could be considered quite a legendary king from our perspective.
And don't forget, once we get to Saul, we then have kings in Israel, even through the Umayyad monarchy period. So it's not just about Egyptian pharaohs kings, it's also about Israelite kings. But of course, that they mainly concentrate in the second volume of this book. This book is more about the Judges period and Saul, and then we get, and the Amarna period, and then we get in the second book, we get into the real united monarchy period of David and Solomon, and then the divided monarchy period afterwards. So the reason why the thing's called legendary kings is because we have kings from both sides at that time.
And so our first legendary king, if I am looking through this chronology accurately, looks like it'd be Akhmose.
Yeah.
So what is first off, what's the relationship that we're exploring here between Akhmose and Israel here in this book? He's obviously the guy who removes the Hyksos from Israel, or not Israel, excuse me, Egypt. So of course that could be incredibly important for what's going on in the Judges period. What do we have as far as some information surrounding him as our first legendary king, specifically on the Egyptian side?
Well, the irony of all this, of course, is that in the old days, Egyptologists used to argue, and in fact, Israeli archaeologists as well would argue that Jericho was destroyed by King Thutmose. So when he expels the Hyksos, he goes trundling off to Jericho and wipes that out. This is the city I was telling you about, which had collapsed and was burnt to the ground. But of course, we have no evidence at all the Egyptians did that or went into that area. In fact, it's very, very clear that Thutmose himself, he went out from Egypt across northern Sinai to a place called Sharuhen, and he besieged that place for 3 years, and he wiped it out after 3 years. The Hyksos had moved there, and then they departed, whether they departed into the Sharon Plain or whether they went by sea off to Greece or wherever. That's the tradition, of course, that some of the Hyksos went in that area. That he then destroyed that city to teach the foreigners a lesson, as it were. But that was not normal Egyptian policy. Egyptian policy was to dominate cities and make use of those cities for the trading network, the empire. It was no use to them to destroy cities that were functioning as part of the empire. In fact, it's usually destruction of cities is usually done by barbarian groups, not civilizations. So it's very rare that you find an Egyptian pharaoh actually destroying a city. Very rare. They might fight against them, and they might execute the rulers of the city or place their sons on the throne in those cities, but they actually had relationships with those cities. They were important to those cities. The cities were important to Egypt. So Thutmose, he had one campaign against Sharuhen, and then he went back to Egypt, and he never came back out, as far as we know. After that, he might have gone down to Nubia, but there was a good reason why, because they were frightened at this point that there was a terrible plague in the region, and they didn't want to end up bringing that plague into Egypt. So for the early part of the 18th dynasty, most of the pharaohs didn't really go out campaigning in Canaan. Sometimes they, in the later period, towards the Thutmose period, Thutmose I and Thutmose III, they did use the Via Maris to go north, but that only takes them through the Sharon Plain and up to Megiddo, and then on through the Esdraelon, and then through past Hatzor and up to Syria, through the Bekaa Valley. And that avoided the hill country of Israel. So they weren't in contact at all with the tribes in the hill country. They were just, not important to the Egyptians. So effectively, during the Judges period, there is no relationship between Egypt and the Judges. I think there's one mention of an Egyptian in the whole of the Judges period. So their interest was much more about the tribal issues between the different tribes in the Judges period. There's the oppressions of the Israelite tribes by the various groups like Eglon from Moab and the Philistines and all these other people who dominate during the Judges period for eras and periods. And you got a judge who comes along and overthrows these oppressors, and that's really what the Judges period is about, with no mention of Egypt, of course, and that would apply all the way through the 18th dynasty until you get to the Amana period. So when you say Thutmose, he does not have a relationship with Israel in that context. He's a very important king in the Egyptian terms because he was the one who expelled the Hyksos, but that doesn't mean he has to have a relationship with the Judges.
And for a brief reminder for those who don't recall the period of the Judges, what a judge is essentially a charismatic warlord, kind of elected. Usually the Bible describes it as being elected of God. Politically, whether or not that's how it happened, I guess we don't necessarily know. But the idea was they would unite some or all of the tribes in a war band to go up against whoever the oppressive party was. And so you can see why that would be potentially unimportant to somebody like the pharaoh of what is potentially the most powerful nation in the world at this time, and certainly will be in a couple centuries, really just 1 century.
Yeah, no, that's absolutely right.
Sorry, go ahead.
I'm just saying you're absolutely right in how you described that. The relationship between the tribes and Egypt is irrelevant to Egypt. It's only when you get kings and a nation of Israel with a kingship, a kingdom, that's when we have a totally different situation arising. That's kings to kings then, and that means they have a proper relationship at that point.
And is there any effect that the Hyksos themselves have on Israel being thrown out? Potentially mentioned as one of the groups in Judges. Obviously, I don't think they were called the Hyksos at the time. It seems to be something Manetho calls them much later.
Correct. The term Hyksos is a bit misunderstood. It doesn't mean a people, a nation. It actually means rulers of foreign countries. So it's only the rulers we're talking about and their elite families. It's not actually the overall population. The Egyptians called the population at the time of in Avaris, where the Hyksos were based. He calls them Amu, or the Egyptians call them Amu, which just means Asiatics or Semites. So there's a large population of Semites in Avaris at the time, but there's also these rulers that live amongst the Amu. Hatshepsut refers to these people as Shemau, and Shemau has a determinative figure, hieroglyphic figure of a man with a stick with a bag on the back, which is like a Dick Whittington character. And basically the word means sort of people who have come from afar. They're immigrants. They are not part of the actual region. They've come from somewhere else. That's the way that they're described by the Egyptians. But it's very interesting because the greater Hyksos, there's two periods of Hyksos. There's the lesser Hyksos or early Hyksos, who all have Semitic names, basically. They're the ones who invade the place, Egypt in the first place. But then later on, there's a major dynasty called the Greater Hyksos dynasty, which is normally given the term 15th dynasty, although I think it's probably the 17th. That's what Eusebius tells us. They are different. They are merchant kings. They are big traders. They have fleets of ships, etc. And whether they are Semites or something else, i.e. Indo-Europeans, is a debatable question. Their names are either Egyptianized, so that doesn't tell us whether they're Semites or Indo-Europeans, or they can be interpreted both ways. They could be Semitic names or they could be Indo-European names. So these greater Hyksos, they're the ones that are expelled from Egypt by Thutmose. And first of all, they go out into the coastal plain and Sharuhan and that area. Then the Egyptians chase them and besiege Sharuhan. And some of them then may have departed to the Aegean, as it were. That's what the tradition says. And the rest of them may have become the city rulers in the lowland areas. Now, what's interesting is when you get to the Amarna period, which is at the end of this sequence, the rulers of the cities in the lowlands, which we call the Pentapolis of the Philistines, have Indo-European names. Now, the Philistines themselves were Indo-Europeans. So it's interesting that, that, for instance, the people like David, who is working as a mercenary for the king of Gath, Achish, that name could be an abbreviated for Akishimigi, which means the son has given. It's a Hurrian name, Akishimigi, and it seems the biblical text is quite fond of having Hurrian names for these people. But it's Indo-European name, which found in the letters, the Amarna letters, the king of Gath is called Shuadata. And Shuadata is an Indo-European name, which also means the son has given. So it seems like his Hurrian allies, because the Hurrians and Indo-Europeans at this time are allied together, his mercenary forces actually call him Akishimigi, and a short form is Akish, which the Bible then borrows in the time of David. But his Indo-European name, his Philistine name, was Shuadata, and they both mean the same thing: the son has given. And all the city rulers that we call the Philistine lords, the Seranim, in the time of Judges, in this period, all have Indo-European names, which suggests to me that they are actually early Philistines as opposed to the later Philistines we have in the time of Ramesses III, when we have the Peleset arriving in the Levant. And that's like a second generation of Philistines moving into the region, as opposed to the early Philistines, which of course are mentioned all the way back to the time of Abraham. You actually have mentions of Philistines in the time of Abraham. So there's a lovely contradiction there, isn't there? The Bible says the Philistines were there from the early patriarchal period, and yet the Egyptologists and the historians say they didn't arrive until Ramesses III's time, which is way, way, way later.
Yeah, and it's a tremendous issue, in my opinion, for the late date Exodus guys. All due respect to Kenneth Kitchen, and indeed there is much due respect, but if you have a Philistine group that doesn't show up until 1178. The Judges period is nearly over. And you know, all that's gone on during the Judges with their oppressions, during the Exodus when they try to avoid them, during the patriarchal age when they're said to be there in between the two, definitely causes a big problem. Now, Indo-European, just to clarify for the audience sake, this is like Anatolian Greek, that kind of area, right?
Yeah, people who speak what we call European languages today, basically. What's interesting, of course, is that if you look at the Septuagint version of these stories, in the patriarchal period, they're called Philistines, Philistim, yeah? But when we get to the time of Samuel and later, they're not called that anymore. They're called aluphaloi in Greek, which basically just means foreigners. So although we translate it as Philistines in our English translations, and I noted earlier on you're talking about somebody who's talking about that later, about the idea that our translations sometimes mislead. The name should be translated according to Septuagint as foreigners. In other words, they are Philistines is just a pejorative, if you like, that covers the whole grouping. It doesn't mean they're specifically one group of people. It basically means foreigners have come into the area, migrants have come in who speak an Indo-European language like Greek. You know, these people in Anatolia who speak Luwian, these people in Greece, Bronze Age Greek, who speak Achaean, they are Indo-Europeans, that we call the Indo-Europeans, the Japhetic group, as Genesis would regard them as, who come from the north. And of course, they integrate with the Levantine populations, the Semites in the area of Levant, and down in Egypt, of course, what the Bible calls the Hamitic-speaking peoples, the people who speak Egyptian. But of course, there's interrelationship going on all the time. I mean, the Egyptian language has lots of Semitic words borrowed into the Egyptian language and vice versa. So, you know, it's hardly surprising that the Indo-Europeans would come into the area and exploit it at certain times. And that's really what we see with the Sea People's invasion at the time of Ramesses III. But it's also what we see in the biblical text when we hear about the Philistines in the period of the Judges.
And so to leave that there, then in our next legendary sort of monarchs are also on the Egyptian side. And I say monarchs because their stories are intricately related with each other. Although, again, probably not going to make too big of an appearance on the other side. Hatshepsut and Thutmose III are kind of the next really legendary monarchs there.
That's right.
What appearance, or if any, do they have here in your book, and do they show up in the Israelite history? Of course, likely not, given what we know here now about the Judges.
Well, we're still in the Judges period, so in the relationship remains the same, but they're very key individuals, because one of the great things that archaeologists do in Israel is they try to find a destruction layer at Megiddo, because we have the famous Megiddo campaign of Thutmose III. But if you read that campaign in the reports that we have on the walls of Karnak and other places, it's very clear there's no mention at all that Thutmose destroyed the city. It would be loco for him to do that. I mean, he simply takes the city after a siege, a period of there's a battle outside the city first, and he defeats the group of Canaanite lords who are come to fight and protect Megiddo, and then he takes Megiddo. Why should he destroy it? He wouldn't destroy it. He simply imposes upon Megiddo the hegemony of Egypt. So why archaeologists in Israel have to find the destruction layer and attribute it to Thutmose III is really pointless. I don't understand why they do that. So it's like the way I explained to you, they search desperately for a link to Egypt to date their strata. And this is one example of that. So we may have to adjust our understanding of the strata in relation to Egypt if we start doing things like misinterpreting what the actual archaeological and textual evidence shows us. And the Egyptian text is very clear. There was no destruction of Megiddo at the time of Thutmose III. He merely captured it. Now, Hatshepsut, well, she was not a campaigner. She never went up into the north. In fact, the only thing she really did of note was to send a fleet of ships down the Red Sea to the land of Punt. But she didn't go herself. You know, she's a female pharaoh. So her time was a time of peace. There was not really any campaigning going on then. And then, of course, when Thutmose III takes over from her. He then campaigns literally every year. And he does, campaigns all the way up to the north. He's called the Napoleon of ancient Egypt because he was such a great military leader. But all his interest was in the Sharon Plain and the lowland area, and up north into Syria and on to the Euphrates, where he was fighting against the Mitanni, this Indo-European civilization upon the Euphrates, which had arrived, a few centuries earlier, and in combination with the Hurrians. So we have this movement of Indo-Europeans with their Hurrian allies down into the Levant, which is why I said, we possibly can link them to the Hyksos people coming in during the Second Intermediate period, or the period after the collapse of the 13th dynasty. So again, although these are great pharaohs in our history books, they don't have a real relationship with the tribes in the hill country. There's no reason for them to go to the hill country. There's nothing of interest for them there. They're interested in campaigning against the great civilizations of the north, where, who were confronting Egypt for territorial control in that middle region of Syria, which was the area of competition, effectively.
Yeah, and that one of the big reasons to bring that particular pharaoh, specifically Thutmose, up, is because of the fact that, first off, a lot of people would consider Thutmose III to be the pharaoh of the Exodus, which I think is untenable.
Where you're going now, yeah.
And then also you do have a lot of people who believe that Thutmose III's campaign into Megiddo disproves the Exodus. And so you have people kind of talking from both ends. And really, when you look at it, it doesn't look like it's sufficient for either of the arguments there.
It's ironic, really, because basically you have the Ramesses Exodus theory, which is what Kenneth Kitchen pursues and a number of scholars do. And then you have the evangelical school of archaeologists and historians who take the literal date of the Exodus around 1450, accurately 1446 BC, which plonks you right in the middle of the 18th dynasty. Now, in the latest revisions of Egyptian chronology that are in the Orthodox bracket, in other words, in the last 25 or 30 years, they would put 1446 BC right in the reign of Thutmose III, who is one of the most powerful pharaohs in Egyptian history in the New Kingdom, and a great conqueror. Absolutely no evidence of a destruction of Egypt in that time, no evidence of plagues, no evidence of a large population of Semites in the Eastern Delta. No reason to imagine that Egypt has somehow been crushed by a terrible set of plagues and a destruction of the army, as you find with Ramesses II as well. So they pick the two versions of the Exodus date, whether it's 1250 BC or 1450 BC, whichever you want to go to. Neither has any sign at all of the Exodus story in that period. So it's a bit crazy, really. And that's why you get so many archaeologists and historians saying the Bible, it just wasn't true.
And one thing I do want to point out before we continue here too is just to say, I obviously would have more of a preference for the early daters than the late daters, and I think that especially the ones who talk about Amenhotep rather than Thutmose are definitely putting up a more persuasive argument. That being said, I do find it ironic. There's quite a bit of accusation about sensationalism on your end, isn't there? And yet somehow you have Thutmose as the pharaoh of the Exodus, who nobody knows, and they have Thutmose and Ramses as pharaohs of the Exodus, who everybody knows. It's weird. It seems like the sensationalism is going the other direction, in other words. But I always found that ironic.
Yeah, that and I think it's a little bit ironic to argue for Amenhotep II as the pharaoh of the Exodus as well, because according to Doug Petrovich and others, and the ABR group, Associates for Biblical Research, they have the Exodus in the very same year that the pharaoh Amenhotep II goes campaigning up in the north with a massive army and brings back loads of captives. So hang on a minute, I thought the army was destroyed in the Red Sea. How's that possible? And then if you look at 40 years on, the wilderness period, if you go for this idea, you end up in the reign of Amenhotep III, who was one of the greatest and wealthiest pharaohs in Egyptian history, really rich. His court was like, Versailles. It was magnificent. And that's exactly when Moses is talking to the Israelite tribes just before his death. I think it's in Deuteronomy, where he says, and Egypt is still in decay and destruction 40 years after the Exodus. That's not possible in the time of Amenhotep III's reign. That's absolutely out of the question. Amenhotep III was a fantastic king, wealthy king. Egypt is not impoverished because of a 40-year interval of time period where, you know, they were oppressed or whatever. But if you put them in the Hyksos period when that's happening, that is exactly what we have. We have the Egyptian national pharaohs oppressed down in the south. They have no power. The Hyksos rulers in the north. And that is exactly what Moses is describing when he talks about the idea that after 40 years, Egypt is still down. It's no longer a great kingdom anymore. That is not possible in either the reign of Amenhotep II or Thutmose III or even Ramesses II. It doesn't apply there. So is Moses lying or is Moses telling the truth? In which case you have to find a period 40 years after Exodus. You have to find a period in Egypt where Egypt is itself down and at the bottom, not able to be a great kingdom anymore. And the only time that happened is in the time of the Hyksos period.
And you did just mention one of the next kings that would be a little bit important here too, and that would be Amenhotep.
Amenhotep.
Yeah. Amenhotep. So is it not then, just to briefly get a clarification on that, is it not the because I would typically say Amenhotep, like kind of quickly like that. Is that not actually an accurate pronunciation?
There's lots of ways. You could call him Amenophis if you want to go to the Greek, but Amenhotep or Amunhotep would be more traditional in terms of Egyptological ways of saying things. Although it's not really the way the names were pronounced in the ancient world anyway. I'll give you a great example of that. We all talk about Ramesses the Great, Ramesses II, but we know his name wasn't Ramesses at all. That's just the Greek version of the name. If you look at the Hittite treaty text with Ramesses, where we have it in cuneiform, we have a tablet with it all in cuneiform. And cuneiform is a syllabic script. In other words, you have, instead of having consonants, you have different elements like ta, mi, da, do, all these little elements. So we know the value of the vowels in this case. Well, there, in the Hittite version of the treaty, we actually have the full name of Ramesses II, and it's Washmuaria Shatapnaria Riamashesha Miyamana. So his name was actually Riamashisha, not Ramesses. Ramesses is the Greek version of it. Okay, so you have to understand that Egyptologists use this sort of Egypto-speaks, shorthand version that we communicate with and we write in our books, but it isn't actually how the names were actually pronounced in the ancient world. What we do know is the Hittite scribes who were writing the treaty heard his name as Riamashisha. Okay, and that is very important for understanding who Shishak the Bible is, because it certainly isn't Shoshank.
Yeah, and by the way, friends, to give you guys a example that many of you would be very familiar with that is King Cyrus is actually Cyrus is not his name; it is Kurus is the way
Kurosh,
Kurosh,
exactly.
And it's just something that happens with the transliteration of language. We often call James the Apostle James. His name would have been Yaakov.
Exactly.
Which is of course very, very greatly different. But now, so when we get to Amenhotep III, now we're actually starting to get to a little bit of impact onto Israel. We're not quite to the period of Saul yet, but we're at least getting very close to this whole period of time. So what's some of the stuff that Amenhotep III would be doing around this time, and what's going on the Israelite side?
Well, now it gets interesting, doesn't it? Because we're now into what we call the Amarna period. The first thing to just discuss briefly is the fact that you have a 50-50 divide in Egyptology as to whether or not there was a long co-regency between Amenhotep III and his son Akhenaten, a very famous pharaoh, the heretic pharaoh, who was originally called Amenhotep IV, but he changed his name to Akhenaten. And he's the great heretic who created monotheism in Egypt for a brief period of time, the worship of Aten, the sun, the light of the sun, or the sun disk. Now, and I believe the evidence is overwhelming now that there was a long co-regency between Amenhotep III, his father, and Akhenaten the son, it appears that he made his son a co-regent when Amenhotep III had his 30th year, which is a jubilee year, a year where they celebrated a renewal process. And it looks like that's when he appointed his son as co-regent. And his son then went off and created his own city called Amarna, Akhenaten, which is in Middle Egypt. And that's where he lived while his father was living in Thebes, in Luxor. So if that is the case, then this monotheism that comes, this worship of the light of the sun, occurs during this era of the co-regency. And it seems clear from most Egyptologists' perspective now that Artanism was about Akhenaten making his father the living Aten. Why did he call Aten the living Aten? Because he was saying that his father was the Aten. He was making him into a god, effectively. And so it seems from my point of view and a number of Egyptologists' point of view that this is the case, that Artanism is about his father, really. They worship his father. I mean, he was obviously very impressed by his father, who reigned for a long time period, about 37 years. But what
and he also had an affinity for sun worship himself, didn't he?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, it's almost for sure that this Artanism begins a little bit earlier than that, possibly, and something that's very peculiar, and I'd like to just explore with you a little bit. And it's very, very controversial, this, but it's something we should think about. If we are in this revised timeline here, where we're coming into the time of the books of Samuel, we're coming into the time of Saul, we're coming into the time in Egypt's sense of Artanism, and then we're coming, of course, in Israelite terms, in terms of the Psalms of David. Now, a lot of scholars have noted the similarity between Psalm 104, supposedly composed by David, and the hymn to the Aten, composed by Akhenaten. They are very, very extraordinarily similar. The phrasing and phraseology is the same. The subject matter is the same in them. Who wrote the original? It's difficult to say. But of course, in the conventional stream, Akhenaten is before the Exodus, not the time of David. But now that we've revised the chronology and we've got these two as contemporaries, and Akhenaten slightly before David as king, then we could perhaps see a borrowing there by David from the solar aspect that we find in Psalms and Yahwism, the fact that we have a monarchy now in Israel, a monarchy which looks to copy other monarchies in the different civilizations of the world, which all had solar deities, but Yahwism becomes a solar deity in this context at this period. And it's only until the time of Josiah when we have even all the way through that period at the Temple of Solomon, there's a chariot of the sun in the courtyard. So the solar aspects of Yahwism are there until the Josiah reforms. So it's possible that the monarchy itself has borrowed this solar imagery, the idea of the light of God. And the orientation of the temple, for instance, is towards the sunrise. So we have this all the time, this idea of solar aspects of Yahwism. So it all may begin with the relationship between David and Akhenaten and Artanism. And also, in effect, Artanism itself may be a looking towards Yahwism. And that's very interesting because, and this is something I'd like to sort of like delve into here, that we have, even in the time of Amenhotep II, who we mentioned earlier on, he campaigned in the lowland regions, okay, and of which was to the west of the hill country of Israel. And this is in the Judges period, remember, and he captures a number of what we would call Semites from this region, especially from the hill country around Samaria. And he actually he marries a girl who is not of high rank from that region, with an interesting name. And her name, which I forget at the moment, but her name has an ending. That ending is Yah. Okay. Now, all the way through the kings from Amenhotep II through to the Elamana period, they marry women with the name Yah on the end. And then when we get to the time of Akhenaten and Amenhotep III, in Egypt, there's a family called with the parents called Yuya and Tuya, both of which have Yah on the end of their names. And then one of their sons is called Aya, who then becomes the Pharaoh I. And so we have all these different people. And in the Amana court itself, we have Kia, one of the favorites of Akhenaten. And we have Tia, Akhenaten's mother, the wife of Amenhotep III. And it's in this period where we have all these Yah names, all the way through, even to the time of Ramesses II, where we have a Yah name as well. And there's probably 30 or 40 of them. Now, why is it in this period we have a Semitic family in the royal court of Egypt, the Yuya and Tuyas, both blonde-haired? They're not dark-haired. Their mummies have been found. We have their mummies. And we have all these Yah names. And is it possible that the introduction of a Semite into the royal family with Amenhotep II starts a process whereby there is a relationship between the Israelites and the Egyptian monarchy at this period, which is why we have monotheism, Yahwism, and also the solar worship aspect in Israel, plus in Egypt, Artenism, which is also a solar deity, a deity of light, and all these Israelites, if you like, in the court, part of the court. Even Akhenaten's tutor was a Semitic person. We think he might have been a Hebrew. So is that really why we have we have monotheism in Egypt at the time where David is coming to power in Israel? And that's a very controversial thing, but it's worth thinking about.
And one of the things that I think is particularly interesting about that, well, there's two. The first one being that because Autonism is looked at so negatively in the rest of Egyptian history, I always found it peculiar that, in the late date, we'd have Akhenaten still being roughly 300 years before, the period of David, and even 100 years before Moses. In the early date, he's going to be after Moses, but he's still going to be that couple hundred years before David. And it does seem odd that David would still be taking influence from that, which in both scenarios he would have to be, considering that it would not only be very far in the past, but at this point thoroughly kind of swept under the rug, right? You have all these people trying to get rid of Platonism in their history. So there's no reason he should have really good knowledge of it, seemingly. The other thing that I've found particularly interesting about this as well is I think considering the proximity of these two groups, and they're the first two monotheistic groups that we have in world history, and they're right next to each other, and they constantly reference each other with like the Merneptah Stele or the Book of Exodus and stuff like that. There has to be some link between, and this is not even speaking necessarily about the hymn, but just between the fact that they're both monotheistic in the first place. It does seem like there has to be some level of link between these two religions, one taking influence from the other, or both taking influence from the same general person, or something along those lines. It almost seems like it's an impossibility to have another opinion.
Well, it works within a revised dating. It doesn't really work within a conventional dating scheme. But it's interesting because one of the great mysteries for Egyptologists is why Akhenaten totally ignores the pleas of the city rulers, the Indo-European city rulers on the coastal plain for help, because the Habiru are coming down and murdering them in their beds, as it were, and killing them and taking over cities, etc. This in the new chronology, of course, at the time of David. Okay, so we're talking about his Hebrews, his Hebrew mercenaries, who he'd previously signed up to Achish in Gath. So he had a relationship with the king of Gath, and then he split from them and actually took the area. He controlled the area. He conquered the area with his Habiru mercenaries. Now that is interesting, because why did Akhenaten refuse to help those city rulers? Why did he stay out of the conflict? Maybe because within the Egyptian royal family at the time, there were Israelites, Semites, We know there's Semites there, but whether they were Israelites is a different matter. But maybe they were. Maybe the reason why he didn't do anything was because he had kin in Egypt. In fact, he himself was the result of a marriage between a Pharaoh, Amenhotep III, and his wife Tia, who was the daughter of Yoya and Toya, who were Semites, which makes Tia a Semite, and therefore Akhenaten 50% Semite, because he's the child of an Egyptian and a Semite. So is it possible that his attitude towards the Indo-European city dwellers was, I'm not going to help you because I have relatives, almost as it were, in the hills there who are coming to take you over. And he doesn't want to do anything about it. And how does that work out in the future? Well, it works out with a relationship between King Solomon and Egypt, because King Solomon marries Pharaoh's daughter. There must have been a reason why that happened. Is it because David had a relationship with Egypt? Was David effectively the one who was controlling the Northern Empire for Egypt at this period of time? And that's why some sort of deal was made between Egypt, and you mentioned the Pharaoh Seti I, between Seti I, the father of Ramesses II, and David, whose son was then betrothed to the daughter of Seti I's son, Ramesses II. That's the picture you could have with this new chronology, which you can't have with a conventional dating scheme. So the reason why Solomon becomes the great merchant prince is because he's the interlocutor between all the different civilizations in trading network on behalf of the Egyptian pharaoh in Egypt.
Now, one brief aside, the Berlin pedestal is supposed to be from this particular era in time, and is said to mention Israel, although that is controversial. People aren't necessarily sure about that. Right. So that would be roughly around the same period, a little bit after I think the Armana letters were published, but I'm not 100% sure on that. Is there a link here between what is, first off, do you think that that's actually a reference to Israel? And second, if it is, it does seem to be a reference to some level of violence against Israel. Would that be in Akhenaten's time or post Akhenaten's time? And does that have any relation to this?
Okay, well, first, I think it does represent Israel in a more archaic form than the Merneptah Stela does, which is a more refined version of the writing of the name. The people who worked on this particular pedestal, which is in the Berlin Museum, they suggested it could be 18th dynasty, Amenhotep III sort of period. I tend to think more likely Ramesses II's time. Okay, so then you have to ask yourself, well, what was happening in the time of Ramesses II? If he was an ally of Solomon, and let's just follow this argument through. It's just something we can think about and talk about. If Ramesses II was the father-in-law of Solomon because he gave his eldest daughter to marry Solomon, and he gave Gezer as a dowry to Solomon, then the period of when Solomon's queen, Egyptian queen, was in Jerusalem starts with the marriage when the temple is consecrated. That's when the marriage took place, on the same day, according to Talmudic tradition. And then we have a period of time until when the Queen of Sheba turns up. And then Solomon, of course, is now interested and infatuated with other women at this point, whereas the Egyptian queen, who was the principal queen of Solomon, is now shoved to one side. And we find that in the Egyptian material, the eldest daughter of Ramesses II was called Bint Anat, which is actually a Semitic name. It's the only Semitic name we have in Egyptian history for a princess. So why did she have a Semitic name? Well, perhaps it was a name given to her because she was betrothed to a Semite, a king called Solomon. Anyway, it seems that during the period, if you look at the Egyptian history side of it, This girl, Bint Anat, appears early in the reign of Ramesses II. Then there's a big lacuna where we don't have her mentioned at all, and then she reappears in the 30s of Ramesses II's reign, where she becomes a great royal wife of the king. Or was she simply given the title Great Royal Wife because she was a great royal wife of King Solomon? Anyway, she reappears in Egypt, and that is exactly the same interval of time between her marriage to Solomon in the consecration of the temple and the time when Solomon began to ignore her and look towards other women like the Queen of Sheba arriving in Egypt. And I think that it's like something called the Song of Solomon, which actually seems to be a melancholy poem, as like, or narrative of an abandoned woman whose husband is the king in the time of Solomon, who he's no longer with her anymore. And that really is very interesting, because we do find north of Jerusalem, up above Jerusalem, looking down on the city of Jerusalem, there is an Egyptian compound where there was a palace and a tomb, an Egyptian tomb. And that may well have been built by Solomon for his Egyptian queen, because we have that famous passage talking about Solomon dismissing his Egyptian queen to a palace out or up from the city of David because of fear of contaminating the holy city with the worship of false deities. So did she return? Did this woman return to Egypt in the 30s of Ramesses II's reign as a woman that was being rejected by the king? And Ramesses II's expectation would have been surely that she would be the mother of the next king of Israel. And of course, Solomon didn't have an Egyptian queen's son follow. He had Rehoboam, who was nothing to do with Egypt. And then, of course, Shishak, whose name Riam-Shisha, remember, Ramesses is the short form. Shishak is the short form of Ramesses' name, then came up and punished Rehoboam by sacking the Temple of Solomon and the palace, taking the treasures back to Egypt. And then his son, Meneptah, retakes Gezer, the dowry that had been given to Solomon, and returns it to the Egyptian hegemony, because Solomon basically had broken his word that the marriage of Ramesses' daughter to Solomon would have resulted in an Egyptian continuation, a partly Egyptian continuation of the kingship in Israel. Now that's complicated, but it fits into this new chronology model very well. It all seems maybe circumstantial, but it seems to fit very nicely if you have Ramesses II as the father-in-law of King Solomon.
Excuse me. Now, to back up just a little bit here, when we get to Saul, it's kind of flipped to the other end here. Now, Saul is really the big climax of this volume, right? He's his revolution, for lack of a better term, although I guess you don't necessarily need a better term, in Israel is essentially the establishment not only of Israel as a legitimate political entity rather than a collection of tribes, but also somewhat of a force to be reckoned with. He's said to be quite an impressive warrior, fighter of the Philistines and so on. So your position and the position taken in Legendary Kings, that this is actually referenced in the Amarna letters, right?
Yeah. It's the ultimate test, isn't it, when you have documents from the period and you have the biblical narrative, and it must be a test of the new chronology, because if the new chronology is wrong, these can't marry together. But if the new chronology is right, we may have an opportunity to actually find out more about King Saul in the time of Samuel. Now, of course, we're not looking for a name in the Amarna letters like Saul, because Saul was a traditional name for him. It means asked for, because he was asked for by the people to become a king, like every other nation. Samuel had to make a king. No longer any time for judges. Now is a time for a king. So he was asked for, Shaul, and that's where the name comes from. Same with Solomon. Solomon's name means peace, because he had 40 years without any wars. I think because he was protected by Ramesses II. That's the main reason. So you've got these traditional names for these kings, we know that one of the names, for instance, of Solomon was Jedediah. That was probably the birth name that he had, the real name. So Saul, we have to look for another name. And in the Amarna letters, we have a guy called Labaya. Now, Labaya means the great lion of, maybe, difficult to say, Yah, the great lion of Yah, just like we have these Yah names in the Amarna period. Labaya appears at this time. And he has a son who is in league with the Habiru chieftain. Now, the son of Saul was Jonathan, and he was in league with his best friend, David, who was the Habiru chieftain, the chieftain who had his Hebrew tribes. And during the time of conflict between Saul and David, Jonathan was going in between the two. So there's a letter in the Alamana letters actually written by Labaya to Pharaoh saying that I did not know my son was consorting with the Habiru. And that is the same story. Okay. And then we have other things like, for instance, it mentions the fact that Labaya writes to Pharaoh because the Indo-European rulers down in the coastline, on the coast, have been writing to Pharaoh complaining that this Labaya had been seizing cities in the hills. And Labaya writes to Pharaoh and he says, of course I've been taking these cities because they were my cities that these Indo-Europeans had taken off me. And I am simply recovering them. And that is exactly what happened in the time of Saul during the Hebrew revolt, when Jonathan and Saul seized Michmash and then also Jebah or Gibeah, which was the two cities that belonged to the tribe that Saul belonged to. And so it again matches between the two, between what Labaya is writing to Pharaoh and what is the story in the books of Samuel about the Hebrew revolt. And you've got many examples like that. And then we go on to what the Indo-European kings are writing down in the coastline about the death of Labaya, in which case they are campaigning up in the Esdraelon Valley, up in the Jezreel Valley, and they kill Labaya somewhere in that area. And of course, Saul is killed by the Philistines who come from that region, the coastal plain, on Mount Gilboa, which is in the Jezreel Valley. So again, the stories match the what's reported by the Indo-European kings of the lowlands area, which they call, referring to the killing of Labaya, and also the Philistine rulers who kill who kill Saul on Mount Gilboa. It seems to match very clearly.
So the king and the Egyptian side of this, are we still in the reign of, let me get you out of the solo layout here, we're going to talk. Are we still in the reign of Akhenaten at the time that Labaya is fighting, or are we experiencing some carryover? How's that working out on the Egyptian side?
Well, it looks like this is all happening in the time of Akhenaten, because he's doing nothing to stop this from happening, basically. But the Philistines, or I'm going to call them Philistines, the Indo-European cities, state rulers down there, which in the New Chronology are the Philistines of the Bible, they are oppressing the Israelites. This is the last Philistine oppression, and it's in that time that Saul and Jonathan, defeat the Philistines to begin with, and then eventually we have the climax where the Philistines, in fact, succeed in killing both Jonathan and Saul, leaving only one son alive, which is Ishbosheth, or Ishbaal, as his name really was. And we have Amarna letters from that guy. He's called Mutbaal, which means man of Baal in Canaanite, which is Ishbaal, man of Baal in Hebrew. And he's across in Transjordan, and he's made a kingdom there for himself because he's fled from the Battle of Gilboa. He's no longer in the hill country where Saul was ruling from. He's having to rule from Transjordan. And we have letters from him to Pharaoh, mentioning people like Ahab, who is Joab, David's general. He mentions Yishai, which is Jesse, which is David's father. And he even mentions David himself, and the name there is Dadua. Okay, now Dadua is probably a Hurrian version of the name Dud or Doid, the Egyptian, the Israelite name Hebrew name for David. So it's a remarkable. We have all these personalities from the books of Samuel appearing in a single letter from Mutbal, Ishbal to Pharaoh. So it's not just about Labiah being Saul; it's also about other people in this period, also mentioned in the inscription in the letters going to Egypt, which correspond with the people that we read about in the book of Samuel, 1 Samuel.
And one question I know people will often ask at this point is about the Habiru. Now, the Habiru, of course, is a disputed term, I think, by many people. I think one of the bigger questions that comes is does this refer to an ethnic group or a class? Now, you would say both, if I understand correctly. Is that right?
No, I wouldn't actually. I would say they're a class of people. Okay. Let's put it this way, okay? Israelites were Hebrews, okay? But not all Hebrews were Israelites, okay? So, in other words, Israelites are the descendants of Jacob. But there are other Hebrews, and the term itself means something like dusty feet. It means that they are not people who are city dwellers. They migrate through the landscape. They are like, it's a derogative term that we use in the Western world today, but like gypsies. So they are wanderers. They are not sedentary. But of course, they live in the hill country. They live in tents. They sheep farm. They're not particularly agriculturists. And they're wanderers, just like the patriarchs were. They're not city dwellers so much. So the word Habiru in this context, or Sargaz as it is in Sumerian logogram form, represents a class of people, and they are mostly referred to as mercenaries because they hire themselves, the men do anyway, they hire themselves out as mercenary forces. And David has his Habirus, and so does Saul have his Habirus. And in fact, we even have a separation between Israelites and Habirus in the biblical text. When the Philistines come back into the hill country, the Hebrews flee and the Israelites hide in their holes. So they're two different people. You know, they are not necessarily Israelites. They are Hebrews. And it's a pejorative term, of course. It's mostly referred to by the enemies of Israel. They call themselves Hebrews. They're part of that class of nobodies. And it's very rare that you will find the Israelites themselves referring to themselves as Hebrews, although their language is called Hebrew. So I think that we're looking at a separate group of people, but they play a major role in the revolt against the Philistines because the Hebrews are the mercenaries working for David and Saul. So there is a group of people, and then they turn. When David becomes king in Hebron, they turn on those Philistines that had hired them, like Achish, their hirelings, and they actually attack these city-state rulers after the death of Saul. Now, that's what we also see in the minor letters with the Habiru. They're doing exactly the same thing. And so they're, even the king of Gath accuses the king of Jerusalem, the Jebus, of being a Habiru as a pejorative, although obviously the guy in the Jebus is not a Semite even, but he's just referring to him as a type of rebel Habiru type of person in the minor letters. So, they are a separate element. They're not Israelite as such, but they work with the Israelites to defeat the Philistines.
So would it be fair to say that's similar to like the Greek barbarian, where it's like it doesn't really refer to a set group of people? It's kind of just those groups out there that are less civilized, quote unquote?
Yeah, it's a term. I mean, I think it's right to say that isn't Abraham also referred to as a Habiru or Hebrew at one point? It's people who are on the line, the descent of Seth, as it were, biblical Seth, as opposed to the line of Cain. Cain being the city dwellers, the people with temples and kings and priests and all those sort of things, and the patriarchal line, which are basically pastoralists, and they wander through the network of city-states in this era all the way through, and therefore they're not regarded, although, as I said, Israelites are Hebrews, but not all Hebrews are Israelites. So the patriarchs are Hebrews, but they don't become Israelites essentially until Jacob. And then we have Jacob called Israel, and his descendants are now called Israelites. And they are specifically those who have blood relationship to Jacob, as opposed to the other Hebrews around the region. And when we refer to the Exodus, for instance, we talk about a mixed multitude. That's because they're not all Israelites. There are some Hebrews in there as well. And so we have to think of them as a separate group of people. But people can be accused, even Israelites, can be accused by their enemies of being Hebrews as a pejorative, as a Habiru. And so it's a derogatory term, basically.
Yeah, and one of the main reasons to ask that question is because people will often say, well, this usage of Habiru or that usage of Habiru is, something that would discredit the whole notion. And when you recognize the proper place of Habiru, then it would make sense for example, a group in, like Biblos, as one of the things that the Habiru are attacking in the Amarna letters. That doesn't necessarily have to be Israelites if Habiru is not used to directly refer to Israelites per se. So that is something I think would be kind of interesting there. And, there's, of course, a lot of back and forth that goes with there. One thing I was curious with is Habiru the way the Egyptians would have pronounced that?
Well, this is an interesting question because I told you we have this Egypto speak, which is the way we express things. We don't really know how the word's pronounced. It is written, and you'll find in the literature as Apiru. Apiru, okay, but that would be very close to Ibrim, which is the word Hebrew in Hebrew. So Apiru is the closest we have in Egyptian, but it probably wasn't pronounced exactly like that. And certainly the labial P and B, Apiru would be, or Ibiru, Abiru. That's also a sort of thing that linguists can argue about, till the cows come home. But it's certainly very close. But and in some of the letters they refer to it as a Sumerian logogram, which is like medieval kings referring to Latin, or in courts of law today using Latin terminology, and they call them sagas, which is basically the same thing, basically wanderers, people who are not sedentary. So there are various terms, but I think, given the context of the new chronology, as opposed to the separating the Hebrews from the time of the Amarna period, now that they're no longer separated, now they're together, I think we can safely say that the Habiru of the Amarna letters are the Hebrews of the time of Samuel and the times of books of Samuel.
And so our next really legendary king on the Egyptian side is going to be Tutankhamun, although ironically he didn't really do much on the Egyptian history, right? He's more legendary from our perspective as moderns because we found him, kind of that. Yeah. But anyways, well, do we have any? Good.
Go on. Yeah. I mean, a non-entity as a king,
right?
But much loved by the people because he is the guy who restored, although it was his officials, restored the old religion, the Ammonisms of the Thebes, as opposed to the Artanisms of Akhenaten. So he is a restorer, and therefore his tomb is crammed full of material and wealth. Not saying that the rest of the kings didn't have the wealth like that, but we don't have their tombs are full of treasure. Anyway, so he was pretty much a non-entity, 9 years on the throne. Interestingly, he looks like he might have died in warfare. That's a possibility, that he had an accident or was pulled from his chariot or something and then was run over by the wheels of the chariot. That's one theory. I don't think he was murdered, as some people would argue. But remember that if he is the son of Amenhotep, of Akhenaten, and Akhenaten was actually 50% Hebrew or Israelite, right, Semitic, because of Tia, his mother, being the daughter of Yuya and Tuya, so it's getting a bit of a tangled web here. But we know that Akhenaten was a son of Amenhotep III, and that Tutankhamun, through DNA analysis, that it was a son of Amenhotep III who was the father of Tutankhamun. Now, Amenhotep III had a daughter, and she was a very important individual. Her name now is Sitamun. Okay, now she was most likely the mother of Tutankhamun, because it was a sister of Akhenaten, and therefore a daughter of Amenhotep III and Tia, who was the mother of Tutankhamun. Now, in which case, what may have happened is Akhenaten and his sister may have produced Tutankhamun in marriage. That quite often in the case in this time when sister and brother married. But Nefertiti was the major wife, but they also had a relationship with this his sister Sitamun, and because she was a name with Amun in it, Sitamun, in the Amarna period, that would have been anathema. So she may have had to change her name, and she may appear in Amarna as the beloved of Akhenaten, Princess or Queen Kia. And there's another Yah name in there again. So it may well be that she actually is the mother of Tutankhamun. And we've always suspected that she might have been, but we've always thought she might be a foreigner. But she could well be, in fact, Akhenaten's sister, Sitamun, with her pet name, Kia. Now, if that's the case, Tutankhamun is now almost 100% Semitic in his bloodline. Okay, so you have this extension of the Semitic relationship all the way through to Tutankhamun, and then on into I, who is also part of the Yuya Tuya family. And then we get to Horemheb or Haremheb, and then we get a change. Then we get into a different line of people. And those kings come from Avaris. And Avaris, of course, was the capital of Egypt during the time when the Semites, the Israelites, were in Egypt under Joseph and all the way through to Moses. So there may well have been a relationship there because they may have been descended from people from that region who were partly Semitic as well. So it is possible in this scenario, in the New Chronology scenario, that we have a strong Semitic line, Etamana, which continues all the way through to the marriage of Pharaoh's daughter in the time of Ramesses II to King Solomon. It was all tied together by this filial line of Semitic peoples in the royal court at Amarna and in late 18th dynasty and early 19th dynasty Egypt.
And with our next couple kings, you have Ramses I, Horemheb in between them.
Yeah.
Kind of a lot of nothing going on, it seems, at least as far as relationship between the two. And of course, they're not incredibly important pharaohs anyways. By the time we get to Seti, though, that appears to change quite dramatically. And I think that's what you're picking up in the next volume, right?
Mm-hmm. I can tell you a little bit about that because, I mean, it's just a bit of color that will add to where we're progressing with this storyline. You know, the most famous thing that happened in the reign of Ramesses II is the Battle of Kadesh, which is up on the Orontes River, Tel Nebi Men today, the big tell up there. And that happened in year 5 of Ramesses II. Now, let's just say, for arguments, continuing this idea, that Seti I had a treaty with David, the most powerful ruler in the north, who they became allies, let's say, for argument's sakes. Seti had to find a way to recover the empire that had been lost during the Amarna period. So he had to do a deal, as it were. Now, if that was the case, usually those sorts of alliances were signed and sealed with marriages. That was the standard practice in those days. So let's argue, just for the sake of argument, that Seti I promised David that his son, that Seti I's son, Ramesses, would give his daughter, his first daughter, eldest daughter, to David's son, Solomon, as his queen. Okay, that's the scenario I'm suggesting here. Now, that would require an allegiance between Egypt and Israel in the time of David, where David would have to support the kings of Egypt, what we call the Ramesside period, that's Seti I and Ramesses II onwards. Now, one thing that happens in the early reign of Ramesses II, this is before Solomon becomes the king, as it were, it's still in the time of David, is that he has his great fight against the Hittites in the Battle of Kadesh in the north. And he nearly gets killed. He gets taken for a fool. He gets tricked, and he's besieged by the chariots of the Hittites, and he's about to get killed, and his army is about to be slaughtered. And then these guys come along and suddenly appear out of nowhere, and they come and they defeat the Hittites. They come to the rescue of Ramesses II. Okay. Now, in the label text on the battle scenes of Ramesses II at various temples like Abu Simbel, he refers to these people, these troops who are coming, and he calls them Nearin. Now, the word Nearin has been described as being Asiatic troops coming from somewhere in the region. Okay, from somewhere in that region of Canaan. Okay, and it's interesting, in the very time that we have David on the throne, he refers constantly to his elite troops called Nearim in Hebrew. The same word, Nearin in Egyptian, Nearim in Hebrew. And you can see them all the way through the conflicts in David's reign, the revolts against his rule, etc., where we hear about these Nearin. What if Ramesses II's life was saved by King David's Nearim, who become Nearin in the Egyptian texts? That would be an act of amazing loyalty on the part of David towards Egypt, and would be a proof positive of the allegiance between Seti I and David, which then expands into the reign of Ramesses II, which is why he then fulfills his obligation to give his eldest daughter to Solomon once the Battle of Kadesh is over. It's a bit later than that when that happens. So it would tie together beautifully. And we have this strange story in the Battle of Kadesh where we have these Asiatic troops coming out of nowhere and rescuing Ramesses II with the same name that we find in the Bible in the time of David.
Yeah, and we also have a strange story in general of just Solomon having an Egyptian wife, right? Just because it does seem like it was pretty rare a lot of times, from what I can gather, at least. I'm certainly not the expert on this, but and correct me if I'm wrong here, it does appear that usually the Egyptian prince would marry a princess from someone else's nation, but here we actually have the opposite, which seems to display a lot of trust, a lot of loyalty, a lot of respect for the monarch there in Jerusalem.
It's the very first time that a female from Egypt is sent to somebody else's court to get married. It's usually the other way around. You get the female princesses from the Hittite lands or from the Mesopotamian lands sent to Egypt in marriage to seal treaties, but in this case, it's the opposite way around, and it is remarkable. And there has to be a good reason for that, and I think it's because of the strong alliance between the Israelite monarchy and the early 19th dynasty kings, which comes out of the Amarna period, where we have these Semitic families within the royal court, within the royal family. So I think this is a lovely scenario which works beautifully within the revised chronology, but it has no basis at all in the conventional dating scheme because they're separated by 300 years. It wouldn't make any sense in that context. And it's interesting that, going back to Labaya, that Finkelstein, famous archaeologist from Israel, Tel Aviv University, he actually wrote a paper where he said that Saul was the last Labaya. In other words, he's saying they're so similar in terms of what they did and the territory that they ruled over, that it's remarkable, a coincidence, because they're 300 years apart. But of course, in the new chronology, they're not 300 years apart. They're exactly the same time period. So Labaya can be Saul, as opposed to it being a queer, very strange coincidence that they ruled over the same territory and the same things happen in their reigns in both cases, but separated by 3 centuries. That's Finkelstein saying that.
Yeah, and of course, Finkelstein is certainly no proponent of a biblical understanding of history, right? Or
No.
of the new chronology, for that matter, right?
No. He famously said that you can move Egyptian chronology by 10 years here or 10 years there, but more than that, forget it. It's a complete waste of time. But he himself has revised the stratigraphy and history of Israel by 90 years by shifting King Solomon into the Iron Age 1B, where he's normally put in Iron Age 2A. So he's not averse to doing it in his own field, but he doesn't like the idea of anybody doing it in Egyptology.
Yeah, and there's a lot that could be said there as well. I personally believe, now, obviously, I don't think that people, because they have certain set of worldviews, are necessarily untrustworthy. But sometimes you have very ideologically driven people. I've always seen Finkelstein as a very ideologically driven person, and that can get in the way of a lot of the stuff that you're talking about, right?
Yeah, well, it's understandable, to be honest. I mean, this is a very radical thing I'm talking about here, and it's not surprising that academia is very resistant to these sorts of ideas. They are dramatic. They are radical. But then again, they make sense. So, I don't understand why they are so anti when they could just be a little bit more open-minded and just consider these options. First of all, I'm not dismissing the Bible as a historical text, but at the same time, I'm testing it out to find out whether or not we can trust it or not. It's not that I'm accepting it wholeheartedly. And the same with Egyptian chronology. We have these questions in Egyptian chronology, some of which have been shoved under the rug and they're not talked about anymore. Like, for instance, the fact that Shoshenq I does not campaign in the region of Judah, where Shishak campaigns in the Bible, but campaigns in the north, in the kingdom of what would be the kingdom of Israel in the north, the northern kingdom. That's a total contradiction between what Shoshenq does and what Shishak does, just because the names sound vaguely familiar, but the actual campaigns are totally different. And so most Egyptologists say, well, forget that. We're not going to discuss that. We are stuck with that because it is used, that synchronism between Rehoboam's year 5 and Pharaoh Shishak and Shoshenq I's campaign in year 20 of his reign. They are synced together to make the date of 925 BC, which is the biblical date given to Rehoboam's year 5. And so Egyptian chronology is actually dated via the biblical text. And then they work it way back to Ramesses II using all the regnal dates. And they make Ramesses II the Pharaoh of the Exodus because of the first chapter of Exodus, where we talk about the cities of Ramses, so the slaves build Ramses, right, which is actually Avaris below Ramses in the new chronology. And that means that they then use the Egyptian data to say there's no Exodus, there's no conquest. So they dismiss the Bible in the time of using the time of Ramesses II, having used the Bible to date Egyptian history in the first place, which is a major circular argument, circular reasoning, as I understand it.
Yeah, absolutely. And by the way, to give a brief olive branch to any Finkelstein fans, I do think that ideological bent goes both ways. There are people who are overly scholastic who...
I've lost you. I don't know if it's me or you.
They are overtly conservative, they tend to say, as far as the Christian understanding, and that can lead you in the other direction as well. So I'm not picking on Finkelstein because of his views. I'm just simply saying some people let their ideological bent interfere.
I have to say that also applies to evangelical Christianity too. In the mid-18th dynasty Exodus is the same problem. Okay, they will follow Kenneth Kitcher's chronology for the 19th dynasty and the 18th dynasty to a degree, and therefore they won't even consider adjusting the chronology of Egypt. They're not Egyptologists, but they stick with what Kenneth Kitchen tells them because he's the high priest of chronology and he's an evangelical Christian himself. And therefore, they're not prepared to look back to when Jericho really was destroyed, which is the Middle Bronze Age. And they try to botch the whole thing by putting the conquest of Jericho and the destruction in the middle of the 18th dynasty, for which there is no evidence. You ask any Egyptologist or archaeologist who's not in that school, that ABR school, and they'll tell you that the Jericho was destroyed in the Middle Bronze Age, towards the end of the Middle Bronze Age, not at the end of Late Bronze 1, which is where they'd have to put it if they were talking about mid-18th dynasty Exodus. So they do the same thing. They are blind to the possibility of revising Egyptian dating. So they accept that, but they don't accept Ramesses II as the Pharaoh of the Exodus.
Right. Yeah, and I think that's something that's important for all of us to make sure we try and get past as well. In fact, one of the things that I think helps to sort of amplify how we can get past that, many who watch this stuff are often surprised to know that you're not evangelical yourself. No. And I think that that's a kind of a good thing, actually, all things considered, because it does sort of awaken, I think, us to the possibility of, hey, try to set aside these biases for a second. If you're atheistic, you can certainly take the Bible as history. If you're a Christian, you can certainly look at questioning some of the stuff that is laid out by people you would trust in the evangelical world. All this stuff is very important, I think, when looking at in an unbiased way. the history of the the region and the history of the Bible, the history of Egypt, all that kind of stuff.
Right. I just take the Bible as that,
just like any other.
Sorry.
No, go ahead.
I was just to say, just to answer that, I take the biblical text simply as just like any other ancient text that I deal with. Whether it's an inscription of Ramesses II or something from Mesopotamia, or whatever it is. I don't talk theology in my books because that's not my job. I'm not a theologian. And an agnostic is somebody who's on the road towards understanding as opposed to rejecting out of hand like an atheist. So, my road happens to be particularly stony. I have issues with the biblical text, which I have to overcome. But I treat it like a historical document, and I test it like I would any other historical document. And that's my job to do that. If it benefits faith in other people, that's great. I have no problem with that at all. And if it corrects misunderstandings, then I also think that's a good job that I'm doing. People would disagree. There are many who would disagree, but then they have to explain why they disagree, rather than just simply rejecting it out of hand without any real explanation.
Yeah, and I would love at some point, I know it's happened in the past, but since I do happen to know you both, I wonder if it would ever be possible to have like a roundtable discussion with you and Dr. Petrovich. I find you both to be incredibly fascinating individuals, and I just interviewed him probably about a week ago.
Oh, you did?
I wonder if it would be possible to do something like that.
Was it on Proto-Sinaitic or something else that you talked about?
We were actually talking about early date Exodus because, he, of course, takes the conventional chronology. And so a while back, what I wanted to do when I first actually had reached out to you, I wanted to have 3 different interviews in a row of yourself, Bruce Gore, actually, who's a historian here on YouTube. Although I think his actual title would be something more along the lines of just general educator. I think his degree is in education. And then Dr. Falk.
Doug. Falk. Okay.
Yeah, and Petrovich actually ended up being a replacement for. So it's a long story, but the long and short of it is, the idea was to get new chronology view, conventional early date, and conventional late date, and to have all 3 of them laid out so that people could kind of choose for themselves. We had you end up agreeing, and then Gore ended up agreeing, and Dr. Falk did not agree. And so what ended up happening after that is I was in conversation with Petrovich, and at that point I was wondering if I could, since I only got the 2, if I could have, and you may even remember this because we talked about it a little bit in the show, I was going to have Petrovich actually do a sort of a takedown of new chronology, right? And then we were going to have you kind of come on as a follow-up. But then Petrovich ended up getting into something. I don't remember what it was, but he couldn't ever come on. Lo and behold, 2 years later, we finally get the ability to have him on, right? And by that point, of course, it would be irrelevant to kind of have the plan that we had in the past. So we just figured out, well, we have the new chronology opinion laid out here. Let's go ahead and see if we can have Dr. Petrovich provide a early date conventional chronology one. And I've still never gotten any late daters on. They don't tend to take, I don't know, a lot of people seriously who don't agree with him, to be honest with you.
Falk is a late dater. Falk is
and he won't come on. He's that's fine, of course. But
to be honest with you, I have to be frank about this, that Falk is not a great scholar. And we did have a debate exactly as you're describing here. It was in Prudence, is that right? No, Providence rather. And the 3 of us, Doug, David Falk, and myself were there, and they had an audience of about 100 people, and we all took our turns in presenting our arguments, and then we sat down together to answer questions, etc. And it got quite heated, in fact, to such a degree that David Falk was almost thrown out of the room because he was very, very, what's the word to look at? I'm trying to be kind here. It was quite insulting to both views, Doug and myself's view, which are different. But at least Doug and myself can have a civilized conversation about it, whereas David Falk just wanted to attack and attack and attack. He's not an open-minded scholar. Now, Doug, I disagree with on many things. I certainly disagree with him about the date of the Exodus, not the date 1446. We both agree on that, but when that was in Egyptian terms. So that's the difference. And he follows the argument of people like Bryant Wood that Jericho was actually destroyed in the middle of the 18th dynasty. I don't think the archaeological evidence supports that. So we do have our disagreements about those sorts of things, and we disagree also about the translations of the Proto-Sinaitic inscriptions in Sinai. His translations and the ones that have been done by Rabbi Shlomo Bar Ron and myself are very different. So there are lots of things to disagree about, and I think he once famously said, Doug, that he was going to write a volume to destroy the new chronology and make sure nobody ever followed it. Now, I don't think he ever did bother to write that book. Maybe he's mellowed a bit since then. I don't know. But I don't know how fruitful it would be for the two of us to argue on your broadcast. I think we wouldn't come to any agreements, and I don't suppose that's the case in most debates these days. I mean, you end up all with nobody ever agrees from one side of the debate with the other side. But you could do what you've done here, which is to have one interview with the new chronology proponent and one interview with the mid-18th dynasty proponent. And then if you could get somebody like David Falk or somebody else to do the Ramesside one, then your viewers could watch all three and, decide themselves. They could become the jury on which of the three versions makes the most sense to them. And that could be quite useful. But I think, having two or three of us arguing against each other, it might be good television or good YouTube, but it's not actually that not useful in terms of actually achieving anything, I don't think.
Well, and I will admit that is something that is it's something we've been trying to, me and a good buddy of mine, Standing for Truth, we've been trying to bring back a little bit more as far as, the old style of debate. But it is true that, especially online, I think the really unfortunate thing is if you're not meeting with somebody face to face, it can be very easy to just turn it into a blood sport, whereas it's supposed to be a pursuit of truth.
It's quite difficult as well when you're on the internet, because you can interject into something and interrupt somebody and the line breaks or whatever. Even when we're having a conversation together, sometimes it's difficult to coordinate your responses to my responses, etc. So I don't think it's a good way to do it. In fact, I had a big debate with Kenneth Kitchen in a university in Britain a few years back now. I think it was early 2000s. And there was 400 people in the audience. And we had a big debate between Ramesses Exodus theory and the 13th dynasty Exodus theory. And at the end of the day, Kenneth Kitchen himself admitted in front of the public that actually the new chronology Exodus scenario was as strong as his own Ramesside Exodus theory. In other words, he wasn't prepared to reject his Ramesside Exodus theory, but he was prepared at that stage, having lambasted me, calling me 90% rubbish. He then accepted at that debate that there was something in the new chronology dating of the Exodus in the Middle Bronze Age. So even my most antagonistic proponents, eventually they do come round to it. But the trouble is the damage is already done by then, because they've already done their critique, as it were. And now, when they suddenly turn around and say, well, actually, there's something in this, it's all rather too late in the day.
Yeah, certainly understand that. We have been going just about 2 hours, so I want to start to wrap up some of this so we can be respectful, not generous. It's the opposite way.
Right.
David has been generous to us. We want to be respectful to his time. But nonetheless, so I want to briefly recap the kind of things that you're speaking about in this volume, kind of starting with the beginning of the Judges period and then leading up to the climax here of Saul actually breaking forward, establishing a united monarchy, some of the relation between Akhenaten and David, or Atenism and Yahwism to be more specific. And then the next volume, we're going to start talking about relationship between Solomon, Ramses, as well as David and Seti.
Yeah.
Do you have any sort of
going on into the divided monarchy period as well? Yes, absolutely.
Yeah, so exactly. Into eventually ending with Nebuchadnezzar, who of course is going to be the guy who takes down Jerusalem. I think at that time the king is Hosea. But is there anything you'd like to add to that little synopsis here? And by the way, real quickly before I pass that to you guys, link is going to be in the live chat as well as the description. If you're not watching this live, I wasn't able to set up the description now, but if you're watching this after the fact, it will be in the description. Link is going to be down there to all three parts of this volume. It's only $21, and it's a fantastic read. I was approaching this as somebody who hadn't read it for the sake of the audience, but if you do actually get to read it, I can tell you it is an absolutely fantastic read. Go ahead.
Well, thank you for that. That's very good to know. Yeah, I would just mention one other thing that I forgot to mention earlier, that when I'm in the first part of the book, in part 1, where we deal with the new evidence that's coming up about the Exodus and the wandering years, etc., I do cover the Proto-Sinaitic inscriptions in one very long chapter. And the translations that have been got now from those particular inscriptions from Sinai are amazing, because they seem to be, in some cases, several cases, the very words of Moses, with references to manna and how you should follow the instructions of the Father, of how you were brought out of Egypt, from the garden, and references to golden calves and things like that. They're in these Proto-Sinaitic inscriptions carved on the rocks in the Sinai desert. And if anything, this is the most dramatic piece of evidence to prove that the biblical texts of Exodus, wanderings, and conquest are real historical events, because we may have extra biblical words of Moses carved into the rocks of Sinai. And that is a fascinating chapter, and that's in part 1 of Legendary Kings, volume 1.
Yeah, and that's also and now for those of you guys who are fans of Dr. Petrovich, you're going to have a little bit of a disagreement there, but that's of course fine. But what they do both agree on, and one of the things that I think is probably the I'd say my favorite part of Legendary Kings actually is the sort of revelation here that we do have very solid evidence of people who are speaking in what appears to be a pre-Hebrew alphabet, and a lot of times even referencing events that took place in the Bible, specific characters even who you see mentioned in the Bible. And now, if there's obviously dispute as to where the Sinai is supposed to be. Some people say Saudi Arabia, and obviously that would create a contradiction between this here. But if you do take the traditional understanding there of where Sinai is supposed to be, then this obviously lines up pretty nicely there. And of course, even if you don't take that view, there is the question, right? Why is there Proto-Sinaitic Hebrew here, if indeed there is nothing to be said there? So again, friends, link is going to be here in the live chat. As a matter of fact, let me go ahead and get that link right now. This has been a fantastic interview, as they always are. I very, very much appreciate you giving us your time here again. This is the third time we've actually had you on, and so I appreciate that you've been a good friend to the channel here, despite having no obligations to me whatsoever, because I'm obviously just this small YouTube guy, so I greatly appreciate it.
That's not what it's all about, CJ. It's all about having interesting conversations, and you always give me an interesting conversation, so I do appreciate it.
Thank you very much. Friends, we're going to go ahead and get out of here. If you guys are interested, I'm interviewing another gentleman, Chris Date, later on tonight, about 6 p.m. Mountain Time. We're going to be talking physicalism and dualism. Hope to see you there if you're interested in that sort of thing. Yeah, other than that, friends, this has been a fantastic interview. And if the Lord wills and tarries, we will be seeing you soon. God bless.
Okay.